Hi guys, this is Jake Murray, and in this video I'm going to be taking you through the process of painting a bone-crunching punch. So here I have started in Coral Painter. I like to switch back between Painter and Photoshop a lot. Just mostly I like the way that Painter handles drawing and strokes. For some reason, strokes tend to be smoother and more, I don't know, direct in Painter than they tend to be in Photoshop. But what I'm doing here at the beginning, you can see the first stroke that I made was this arc. And what that is I'm laying out the direction and the arc and the movement of the punch that I am wanting to draw. And this is going to be really the most important element of the whole piece as I go along, because as I establish my figures, and even once I get into figuring out the lighting scheme and all that stuff, everything is really going to fall into that arc and try to emphasize that arc. It's going to be our main sort of visual pathway for our viewers, as we want them to just be looking straight into this punch. So as I'm working out these figures and these poses for this composition, I'm constantly thinking about gesture and motion. Almost every aspect of these figures begins with a kind of line of action, and that really helps kind of get down an interesting flow to the body and helps you plot out your composition more effectively. And really, I mean, it's just a good method in general for drawing figures in action. Most of these sort of techniques I learned from various, how to draw comic book types of books. The old How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way book I got when I was, probably when I was like 10. And that is just a really great reference for learning how to draw figures in action dynamically, especially when it comes to things like punching and kicking and fighting and just all of that superhero action stuff. That's really where I learned to do most of this process of drawing these characters in motion. It's also worth noting that if you're going to be drawing a figure that's punching or kicking or doing any sort of action that involves a wide range of motion, usually the most interesting poses within the animation of that motion, so in this case a punch, the most interesting poses you'll find in the animation of a punch are going to be at the beginning, so like the wind up of the punch, or after the punch is already connected, so like the follow through. In this case I'm showing the follow through. And there's a bunch of reasons really for this. The first being that the figure itself is just more dynamic. The forces acting on it are more expressed in the pose at the beginning and the end, as opposed to right in the middle, like when the punch connects. And it also has to do with the fact that, like, if we look at this drawing that I have so far here, we see him at the end of the punch, but because of that arc of movement that I set up and the way that it's drawn and the way the pose is laid out, in our minds, in the viewer's mind, we can animate that punch. We see where it came from, what direction it came from, and which direction everything is moving, where that force is going. And because of that, you can direct the reaction of the person being punched better. You'll see once I kind of get into him, his head will be following the motion, be following the direction that that punch is going. And it gives you, having the pose being at the end like this gives the viewer more clues as to what happened, and also sort of mentally engages them to fill in the blanks of the animation, which is always more interesting to a viewer than actually just showing exactly what happened. If I had made this image where the guy's fist was literally just in the other guy's face, first off, the poses probably wouldn't have been so interesting because you don't get much arc movement that way. You don't. The force basically of the punch is stopping right at the other guy's face, and that's not really what you want. You want that whole fluid motion expressed. You want that whole just force evident in your pose. And so, yeah, that's why with something like this, it's always best to either show the wind-up or the follow-through, because we can fill in the rest. We get what's happening or what's going to happen. And really, the most important part of drawing or painting a punch is going to be your figure's poses. You can use all kinds of little techniques and things you'll see me doing later here in the video, motion blurs and debris and all these other kinds of cool things that sort of add to the force and the impact of the punch. But if your character's gestures and poses aren't as strong as possible, then none of that's really going to matter. It's just going to feel kind of out of place. So with heavy actions and big actions like a punch here, you see I've got my boxer guy, one of his legs is sort of flailing outward, and the reason I did that was to kind of help emphasize that arc of the punch that I had set up at the very beginning. But also it tells us that this punch just sort of threw all of his other limbs out. It was just such a strong punch that the force of it just kind of throws the rest of his limbs out a little bit. And that just is another method of just showing force in action, and that's really what's going to sell your piece. Here you can see I'm starting to get into the foreground figure, this poor schmuck getting his face blasted by this guy's fist. I kind of knew early on that I wanted it to be something kind of cybernetic or mechanical, because that way I can kind of show just this blast of parts coming off the side of his face, and it's just another way that I can emphasize just how strong this punch was, that this isn't just soft flesh that this guy is beating into. He's crushing machines and just blowing apart these hard materials with a fist. And again, yeah, it just sells how tough this guy is. So you can see that the direction his head is moving in conjunction with the direction of that punch. His head can't be moving the other way if he's getting punched from the right as he is here. It just doesn't make sense, so that's something you always got to keep in mind with two figures interacting, is that they need to be interacting in a way that makes sense. in terms of motion and action and reaction. So if you have to, pose in front of a mirror or act out the motion, just sort of play pretend. Get up and start throwing punches and pretend like you're getting hit by punches, and pay attention to how your own body is moving, and which way your arms and legs are kind of flailing, or where is your head turning, how far is your head turning, things like that. If you can get yourself into the characters that you want to paint, then you'll have an easier time figuring out their poses and figuring out their interactions with each other. So after I've got my poses figured out and a decent drawing established, now I'm starting to put down some values and figure out my tonal plan for this piece. You can see I've switched to Photoshop because it's just quicker in this case. But I decided early on that I wanted to go for something of a sort of a light on dark on gray type of scheme, which I'm kind of just exploring at this point, but you'll see it come together a little bit more later, where the highest contrast area is going to be right in that central focal point where the punch connected. And really, as with any painting that you're going to do, you want the values to accentuate your focal points and emphasize what it is that you want your viewer to be paying attention to. Since this painting is all about the punch, we don't want our value to detract from that. We want our value to say, bam, look right here and keep your eyes here, because this is where it's at. This is where the action is. This is what we want you to look at. So by having the highest contrast in that spot, we can lock our viewers' eyes in there. When it comes to posing your characters too, it's worth noting that overlap can play a big part in an interesting composition. If I had posed these guys to just be standing right next to each other and one throwing a punch and the other one getting hit, there are ways to make that interesting, but it wouldn't have really been interesting as putting the camera right on the shoulder of this guy getting hit, because in this case it makes us feel like we're being punched sort of with him, which adds a little bit of intensity to the piece, and it also gives more dimensionality and more space to the piece. There's more illusion of space since we have this guy being punched overlapping the puncher. For most of this painting, I'm using the basic chalk brush in Photoshop. It's probably one of my favorite brushes to use in the program. If I'm doing a painting in Painter, I mean, I have a whole set of brushes that I've scanned in and created on my own and everything like that. And I have some of those in Photoshop too. But for the most part, I'm pretty happy with just this chalk brush with an opacity and flow and jitter set to the pen pressure. So here you can see the value and the tonal plan is starting to really take shape now. And it really plays off this idea that there's a hidden light source between our two figures that is really illuminating our puncher and is at the same time backlighting our foreground figure. And I always kind of liked the mystery sense that this kind of lighting scheme had. You'd see this in some golden age illustrations, old masters paintings where the light source is sort of concealed from view, but it's not necessarily outside the picture. And in this case, it almost kind of hints that there's an explosion maybe coming from the side of our foreground figure's face as a result of being punched so hard, which I really thought was cool for this piece too. At this point, I'm starting to get a little bit more into modeling the form, and it's really tricky with a piece like this to try to contain yourself from really over rendering. I mean, you could go in and just noodle away at the form and the light and the shade, but I really want to sort of emphasize the movement and the action. So throughout this whole process, I'm going to be painting just a little bit looser than maybe I normally would, because that just sort of lends itself to these more action oriented pieces. And if you pay attention, you'll kind of see that in a lot of places, my brush strokes will emphasize this sort of diagonal left to right movement. And that's all deliberate. That just helps to re-emphasize the direction and the motion of our punch, which is, you'll find as I go along here, almost everything that I do, every way that a character is posed and stroke direction and value considerations. Everything ties back into emphasizing that punch so that it just carries the weight and the impact of the piece. I also want to point out too that facial expression and musculature are also important in selling the intensity of something like a punch. You know, dude throwing the punch, he's focused. He's gonna knock this guy out, and that means he's not gonna have necessarily a happy look on his face. Um, I mean, it kind of depends for the mood that you're going. It depends on the mood that you're going for, but in this case, I wanted it to look like this guy is putting everything behind this punch. So his muscles are tensed, his face is tense. It's just everything is so tense, and that just sells the strength of it, the strength of the punch. Here I'm using more of a flat brush to paint with and to block in with. I like it because, as you can see, when I use it in a certain direction, it almost creates this sort of motion blurring effect. I mean, it's sort of a very direct painting sort of method, which I like to use whenever possible. Um, Photoshop filters and things are great, and you'll see me use them later on here. But I like to get as much as I can, at least, out of just painting. So if I have a brush that I can use that will give some effect that I'm going for, some effect of movement or motion or blur that I'm going for, just by painting and just by stroke direction, then I usually prefer to use that as much as possible before throwing in filters and things like that. I mean, it's not to say that there's anything wrong with filters. It's just a personal thing, I think. And here I'm reversing the composition just to make sure that it works from a mirrored perspective too. Yeah, just another good trick to use. I wasn't quite sure what to do with the background. Yeah, my mind tends to want to wander into every single detail of a piece, but lately I'm also learning to sort of cut unnecessary fillers. So what I've got in the background there is sort of just exploration at this point, but you'll see later on that I end up taking it out because just the shape of it, and even though it's in the background and it's more subtle, it's kind of a distraction. That tower thing I've got right there, it's kind of distracting from the flow of the piece and the direction of that punch. And in your artwork, if you find that anything is distracting from the main point of focus, don't be afraid to just get rid of it. Just take it out. You know, you'll be surprised at what people can live with not being in your paintings, as opposed to certain things that are in your paintings that probably shouldn't be there. I wanted to indicate some other figures in the background, like maybe this is some sort of gang of weird cyborg ruffians or something. But it kind of harkens back to like the days of like Power Rangers and things, where the more of these henchmen types that you put against one person, and the more butt they kicked, you know, it just sort of lends to the idea that this is like a really powerful guy, that he's just wasting these guys with a single punch to the face. And you can see kind of by the pose that I've indicated of the main guy in the background there that he's kind of cowering. You know, he kind of sees what's happening to his buddy, and he's kind of like, whoa, maybe I don't really want to be here right now with this guy. And again, it's a storytelling element that livens up the piece. It gets across the idea that this is just not a guy that you want to mess with. And here, after kind of struggling to figure out what I wanted to do with the fists, I decided after looking at his beard that this guy needed some boxing gloves. And just kind of a quirky character thing. Okay, here, now I'm starting to get into color, and something that I've learned to do, a little trick for exploring and discovering color schemes after sort of doing this black and white tonal painting, is I will use the copy all feature of Photoshop to copy a completely flattened version of the image onto a new layer, set that layer to color mode, and then use the gradient map tool. Sorry, I kind of forgot what it was called there. Use the gradient map tool. It's in the image and adjustments menu from the top menu bar. And what that does is it takes value information and maps colors to certain parts of the value spectrum. And so in this case, I wasn't really sure what colors I wanted to use, but I knew that I wanted our boxer to be warmly lit and everything else kind of thrown into a cool lighting. So in the gradient map, I take everything that's lighter value and I assign like an orange color to it. And then everything that's in the lower value range, I assign more of a blue or a grayish tone to it. And the gradient map will take that flattened black and white image that you just created, and it will just automatically throw these colors on it. And since that's all on a color layer that's floating above the rest of your painting, it won't throw off any of your values, like just painting color on an overlay layer might. Your values will all still be exactly what they were before. They'll just have this vibrant color now imposed on them that you can then, as you see I'm doing now I'm just basically painting details and tweaks. You know, the color is pretty much there, so now it's just up to me to adjust it. And it literally only took me a few minutes to get that general color in place. So that's something that I found that I really like using Photoshop for, and enjoy exploring color options that way. It's almost kind of a quick way of doing color comps and just seeing what an interesting way to go is with your color. After I've done some slight adjustments of my color palette on another like overlay or color layer, now I'm just painting opaquely on a layer above everything else. And you'll see, since I want the boxer to be our main focal point, I'm going to detail him the most and sort of refine him the most out of everything here. And that also sort of falls in line with the idea of blurring and motion blur and how that works, where if we were in this space, or if a camera was following this boxer and it's focused on this boxer, but he's moving and he's moving incredibly fast compared to everything else, we'll still see the boxer clearly if that's what our focus is locked in on. But everything around him is going to have that sort of motion blur effect applied. So that's why you see in the background there and pretty much everywhere else, I'm maintaining that sort of horizontal or diagonal stroke direction and trying my best to keep it relatively loose with my strokes and not refine the details as much as I am on our actual boxers, because I want that sense of motion to carry through and that sense of blurring to carry through on the environment around him, so that he stands out more and we get this sense of speed and direction and motion. From this point on, it's just going to be a lot of refining of details and opaque painting. So I'm just going to kind of let you guys watch as I continue to build the piece up without talking a whole lot anymore, unless there's a point to be made about how what I'm doing emphasizes the punch, but most of what is really making this piece and making this punch feel legit is already in place. So, as with any painting, I mean, at this point, yeah, it's all just detail work and making sure everything falls in line and doesn't necessarily distract from what I'm going for. But yeah, at this point, pretty much everything's in place. It's just a matter of refining now. this point, I'm kind of exploring different aspects of this guy's face mask, or, I mean, maybe even it's just a mechanical head on a biological body. But just thinking about how that mask would shatter and kind of break away and be ripped open by this massive punch that it just took. Another thing I kind of forgot to mention earlier was about exaggeration, exaggeration of your poses. If you're using photo reference to paint from and draw from, that's great. You probably should be. I highly encourage it. But a lot of times, your most action packed poses are going to be incredibly hard for somebody to actually pose in front of a camera. Um, the whole idea is kind of that we're trying to capture moments in a painting that you wouldn't necessarily be able to see, or that it would be really hard to capture with a camera. And so, whatever reference you are using, it's always kind of a good idea to exaggerate the pose a bit. Um, with this guy this boxer throwing his punch, that would have been a difficult pose for somebody to hold while I photographed it if I were to paint exactly the way that my reference has it. And even the foreground guy, the way that his head is just being thrown back and his neck is turned compared to the way that the rest of his upper body is turned, that's actually kind of an extreme pose. So everything about the way these guys are posed and everything about this piece is sort of pushed to the extreme. Again, just to reinforce the fact that this is an intense point in time and it's a really hardcore punch. starting to rough in some of the background, some more of the background figures here now. I'm using a really soft, just airbrush, again, just so that I avoid putting in too much detail and distracting from our main action. So I had this idea at this point that maybe these robot guys, we'll just call them KO bots, and as long as they were still up and functioning, they'd have this light on their foreheads, this green light that says OK. But then, once you cracked them in the face and they were just down for the count, it would turn to this red light and say KO. I don't know why. It was just kind of a goofy idea that made me chuckle, so I decided to throw it in there. I mean, there's not a whole lot about this piece that makes a lot of sense, except for the action that we're trying to convey. But aside from that, all the details and everything like that is really just me kind of having fun and being goofy. Here we go. So, if his eye popping out of his helmet wasn't indication enough, now we know for certain that this guy in the foreground is he's knocked out. Using just a little uh, speckle brush here to just create more indication of little bits of debris flying everywhere. And now at this point, I'm pretty happy with the painting itself, the way everything's painted. So now I'm kind of applying a motion blur effect. And the way that I like to do it is I do a copy all. So I select the whole painting and do a copy all and paste it as a flattened image layer. And then I'll apply a motion blur to the entire layer, which you might have seen for just a second there that the whole image just had a blur over it. And then on that layer, I'll add a layer mask and fill it black so that it gets rid of the motion blur, but then I can take an airbrush and paint on that layer mask and start to kind of paint in where I want the blur to be. And that was the last step. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this painting, and I hope you got something out of it and it helped you out, and that it will help you create some mind-numbing punches of your own. Thanks for watching.